The original Bravely Default is a title that I always wanted to play but never got around to it due to me not really being a handheld gamer. This really disappointed me as I've always been a huge fan of job systems in RPGs, which is something that fans of this series praised as the standout mechanic. As you would expect, this acclaimed job system as well as a unique Brave and default battle mechanics all make a return, and just like the original, these are the standout features of Bravely Default 2. Now, despite what the name suggests, Bravely Default 2 is actually the third title in the series. Series producer Tomoto Asano believed that Bravely's second did not live up to fans' expectations. He felt that going back to a formula more similar to the original Bravely Default was the best way to continue the series. As soon as I started up this game, I immediately felt some old school vibes. Bravely Default 2 reminded me of the Super Nintendo era FF games that I used to love all those years ago. This is particularly notable with the Heroes of Light and the main story revolving around the crystals. Even the spell names like Fire and Firaga are straight from the Final Fantasy series. For those of you after an old school style JRPG with a highly addictive job and combat system, then Bravely Default 2 may be worth checking out. Have you had a chance to play this yet? Let me know in the comments. Before we begin, if you like this video, it would help me out a lot if you hit like and sub for more RPG content. Also, come say hi on Twitter or Facebook. Let's get into it. Bravely Default 2 is set in an entirely new world from the previous games in the series, so there's no requirement to have played them. The game takes place on the continent of Excellent and follows the main character Seth and 3 other Heroes of Light travelling around the continent to retrieve 4 stolen elemental crystals. Yeah, been there, done that. I never cared much at all for the story. I don't know if it's just me, but I never really cared for any story that involves crystals. I will say though that I did enjoy seeing the actual impact that the crystals had on the town, such as the water crystal flooding half of Savalon, or the earth crystal causing giant trees and roots to grow through Wiswold. But even so, the story is one of the weakest parts of Bravely Default 2. That's not to say it's bad. The dialogue is well written and the voice acting is generally good, it's just that I never really wanted to see more. In a game that has such an awesome combat and job system, the average at best story is one of the main factors holding it back from becoming an outstanding title. At least the characters as a whole were quite strong. The 3 main characters that accompany Seth all grew on me as the game progressed, and most of the banter between them was engaging and fun to watch. Just about all of the scenes were voice acted too, and the range of different accents helped give a lot of these characters charm and personality. Unfortunately, voice acting was for some reason completely absent during the optional party story events, which are kinda like skits from the Tales of series. These events do a good job in teaching us more about the main party, but they are oddly unvoiced, and this was a missed opportunity.
Never mind all the fancy talk, Selena. Let's just bash him and take the bloody thing. The old codger's already got one foot in the grave. We'll be done with him in no time.
Now let's get into the core of the game, the combat and the job system. This is the #1 reason that you're going to want to play Bravely Default 2. To be honest, I wasn't really sure of the game as a whole initially, but it didn't take long for the gameplay to win me over. Basically, you've got a turn-based system with your 4 characters up against some enemies. Your characters can attack, use an item, or use an ability from their current job or sub-job. Unique to this series, however, is the Brave and Default mechanics. When selecting Default, the character will guard and obtain a Brave point, which can be accumulated up to 3 times. These Brave points can then be used to perform additional actions. For instance, if the character has 3 Brave points, they can use all 3 for a total of 4 different actions in a single turn. You can also go into Brave point debt if you use more BP than you currently have. This is a great way to maximize your output, but at the expense of not being able to act for a few turns. What I love about this is how well it works in the whole scheme of things. What I mean is that there are many other factors that will influence when you should or shouldn't use Brave and Default. For instance, if an enemy is defaulting, you don't want to unleash everything then because the damage will be reduced. There are also loads of skills in the game that provide additional benefits to stocking up on Brave points, or perhaps not stocking them up at all. There is just always so much to think about and so many ways to go about each battle, which is particularly true with the boss fights, which can be quite difficult and require a lot of thought. Other mechanics that further add to this excellent system include enemy weaknesses and special attacks, which will depend on the current job that you have equipped. These are very useful useful but can't be used too often, so it's important to time their use wisely. Just about everything about this combat system is outstanding, but there was one thing that annoyed the hell out of me, and that is counterattacks. Each boss, for instance, has one or more counterattacks that are activated when your characters use a certain kind of move. For instance, if you use a physical attack on an enemy, a boss may destroy your entire party with an overpowered attack that hits everyone. This countering also sometimes applies to healing spells or buffs, and the worst part is that these counter conditions often change throughout the battle without telling you. In some cases, a message about these counters popped up for a split second on the screen, making it impossible to read. I understand that these counters add to the strategy of battle, but I feel that it draws some of the fights out too much, and it's frustrating as hell when you realize that a character is basically useless for the fight due to their attacks being countered. Ah, job systems. I love you, most of the time. Bravely Default 2, fortunately, has a job system that I loved. As you progress through the game, you'll gain access to loads of different jobs that are all completely unique in terms of their skills and abilities, their passive specialties, and their stat increases. Each job also has different proficiencies in using certain weapons and different weight limits, and I spent a lot of time mixing and matching my equipment for each class. Over-encumbrance mechanics can be very annoying in RPGs, but I felt that it worked very well in Bravely Default 2. One feature that I did want was the ability to save builds. Mixing and matching equipment, abilities, and jobs can take a lot of time, but being able to save builds that work well would have been very useful. When you first start using a job, it's quite useless as it only has a single ability unlocked, but each time you level the job up, you'll gain access to a new ability to use. Things get even more interesting with the ability to equip a sub-job, which provides access to all of its previously learnt abilities. However, it's not always a case of max out a job then forget about it. For one, each character can equip up to 5 passive abilities from any job, provided they've learnt it. Secondly, I also found myself going back and experimenting with new job and ability combinations after learning new things, and I guess this really sums up why this system works so well. There are so many possibilities, so many combinations, and so many things that just work so well together. This, with the excellent combat system, is why you're going to want to play Bravely Default 2. Have you ever seen something from a distance and admired its beauty only to feel the opposite once you see it up close? This is Bravely Default 2. The artistic style is unique, has a load of charm, and yeah, it looks great, especially the towns. However, when you zoomed in, you can really see the low resolution backgrounds, and this takes away from the overall quality. Outside of towns, you'll be treated to a traditional world map with quite a bit to discover, including unique, powerful monsters and treasure chests. I'll also make a note of the dungeons, which are all great. Here, there are a load of optional routes to take and treasure chests to find, which can actually be quite challenging at times. You will get into a lot of fights in these dungeons. Luckily, there's a turbo mode within the combat system, and this makes grinding and taking on weaker enemies much less tedious. But now, I think it's time to talk about one of Bravely Default 2's biggest issues, its technical problems. Now, this isn't the prettiest game or the most hardware intensive, yet there are super frequent frame rate drops, visual glitches, and long load times around every corner. Bravely Default 2 doesn't run well in both handheld or docked mode, and I'm actually surprised that Square Enix released the game in this state. I can only hope that there will be a patch soon to address this issue. Bravely Default 2 took me a lot longer to complete than I expected, totaling in over 60 hours. I did spend a few hours grinding, but a lot of these extra hours were spent completing the many side quests. I find this point very funny. Bravely Default 2 has both the best and the worst types of side quests possible in JRPGs. We'll start with the good ones. There are several fully voiced side quests that tell half-decent stories and teach us a bit about the characters and the world. Some of these also have significant rewards, such as new jobs. This is what side quests should be like. If only they were all like this. Unfortunately, there are even more very poorly designed side quests, and some of these are among the worst side quests I've ever experienced. Some of them require you to spend in excess of 10 minutes running back and forth and back and forth and back and forth from the same 2 locations, or for pretty much nothing. The contrast between the quality of these side quests is something that I've never seen before. While these side quests did steal several hours of my time, it was the card game B&D that truly made the minutes tick. While far from my favourite RPG card game of all time, I personally thought it was awesome and really enjoyed travelling around challenging NPCs in hope of collecting all of the cards and building the strongest deck possible. This game really reminded me of those PS1 era RPG card games that I loved in the past. Bravely Default 2 took a little while to grow on me, but once it did, I was happy to be along for the ride. The main thing that won me over was the gameplay, and the unique Brave and Default system created some excellent boss battles, even if the counter mechanics seemed cheap and unnecessary at times. The combat has so much variety, and this is due to the job system. There are loads of jobs, and mixing and matching different job combinations and tinkering with equipment and abilities provides loads of character customization options. Unfortunately, Bravely Default 2 is plagued with technical issues, and while not game breaking, it does cheapen the experience. Something else that holds the game back from being great is the story. It's just there, and my only motivation to get through it was so that I could learn more jobs and take on more bosses. If you're after an old school Final Fantasy-like RPG with great turn-based combat and a fantastic job system, then Bravely Default 2 is the game for you. What did you think of this game? Do you agree with what I've said? Let me know in the comments. This was Hellfire RPGs, thanks for watching. If you like this, it would help out a lot if you hit like and sub for more RPG content. See you next time.